Luca Moretti had stopped praying. Not because he'd stopped believing in God, because he'd stopped believing in miracles. For 3 years, he had watched the strongest little girl he'd ever known wake up every morning and ask her legs to do something they no longer could. He had emptied bank accounts, flown in surgeons from 3 continents, built an entire rehabilitation wing inside his mansion, promised his daughter that one day she would run into his arms again. And every single promise had been broken. So when Sofia suddenly pushed herself out of her wheelchair in the middle of his charity gala, Luca didn't move. He couldn't. The ballroom faded away. The music stopped. Champagne glasses hung frozen in midair. His little girl, his beautiful little girl, was standing. Her knees shook violently. One step. She almost fell. A bodyguard reached for her. She slapped his hand away. Another step. Tears filled Luca's eyes. "Sofia," he whispered. "Baby." She never looked at him. She wasn't walking toward her father. She wasn't walking toward the doctors who had spent years trying to heal her. She wasn't walking toward the crowd applauding what they thought was a miracle. She was looking at someone else. Across the ballroom, a plus-sized waitress carrying a silver tray. The waitress looked up. The moment their eyes met, the color drained from her face. The tray slipped from her trembling hands. The crystal exploded across the marble floor. "No!" she breathed. Sofia's trembling steps became desperate ones. Then, against every diagnosis, against every prediction, against everything the world had told her she would never do again, she ran. Straight into the waitress's arms. The woman collapsed to her knees, clutching the little girl as though she'd been searching for her all her life. Sofia buried her face against her shoulder, and through broken sobs, she whispered 4 words. "You kept your promise." Luca felt the blood drain from his face. Promise? What promise? His daughter had never met this woman. At least, that's what everyone had wanted him to believe. And in that single moment, the most feared mafia boss in Chicago realized someone had been keeping a secret about the darkest day of his life. Before we rewind to find out exactly who Hannah Carter really is and what happened on the night that changed this family forever, if you believe some promises are worth keeping even when no one's watching to see if you do, hit subscribe, because Hannah's about to prove that in a way this whole ballroom and Luca Moretti never saw coming. And tell me in the comments, what do you think that promise was? Take your best guess. I want to see how close anyone gets before the truth comes out. Also, drop where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far this story travels. Now, let's get back to the story. Hannah Carter had learned, over 4 years of catering Chicago's wealthiest events, that the trick to surviving a room like this was becoming furniture. Move quietly. Refill glasses before anyone noticed they were empty. Smile without inviting conversation. Disappear the moment the tray was passed. The Harbor Lights Grand Hotel's ballroom glittered tonight, with the particular excess reserved for charity galas. Crystal chandeliers throwing prisms of light across marble floors. String quartet weaving Vivaldi through low, moneyed conversation. Silver trays of champagne circulating in the practiced hands of a staff trained to be invisible. "Table 12 needs refills," Chef Marco muttered, passing her in the service corridor with a tray of canapes balanced on one shoulder. "And try not to make eye contact with the Moretti table. Word is the boss doesn't like staff lingering." "I don't linger. I'm a professional ghost." "You're a professional smart mouth. Table 12. Go." Hannah collected a fresh tray of champagne flutes, straightened her apron, and moved back into the ballroom's warm, glittering chaos, weaving between silk gowns and tailored tuxedos with the ease of long practice. She'd worked the Moretti Family Foundation Gala for 3 years running now, ever since the hotel had won the contract. And every year she made the same quiet promise to herself. Stay near the kitchen doors, avoid the head table entirely, and above all, never, under any circumstances, let herself look too closely at the little girl in the pink wheelchair. It was easier some years than others. Tonight, positioned near the edge of the dance floor with a fresh tray of champagne, Hannah caught sight of the Moretti table across the room. Luca Moretti seated with the rigid, contained posture she'd noticed every year. A man who occupied space like he was perpetually braced for something. His daughter positioned in her wheelchair beside him, small hands folded in her lap, while the adults around her exchanged pleasantries she was clearly, painfully excluded from. Hannah's chest tightened, the way it always did. She looked away quickly, focusing instead on the tray in her hands. The careful choreography of moving through the crowd without drawing attention. She'd gotten good at looking away. 3 years of practice had taught her exactly how much distance was safe. Luca Moretti was aware, in the periphery of his attention, that the evening was proceeding exactly as it was meant to. Donors mingled. Cameras flashed discreetly near the auction tables. Vincent worked the room with his usual quiet charm, smoothing over the small frictions that inevitably arose when powerful people gathered in one glittering space. None of it mattered to him beyond the fact that it kept his daughter's rehabilitation wing funded for another year. "You're not eating," Sophia observed, from the wheelchair beside him, her 7-year-old voice carrying the particular bluntness only children seem to manage in rooms full of careful adult diplomacy. "I'm working." "You're always working." She poked at her own plate without enthusiasm. "Claire says I did really good in therapy today. I moved my foot 3 whole inches." Something in Luca's chest tightened, the familiar ache he carried everywhere now. 3 years old and never healing. "That's wonderful, baby." "You always say that, but you never smile when you say it." He forced something onto his face that he hoped passed for a smile, though he suspected, from the flicker of disappointment in Sophia's eyes, that it hadn't quite succeeded. He'd lost the knack for genuine smiles somewhere on Ashwood Bridge 3 years ago, along with considerably more than that. "Can I have more juice?" Sophia asked, mercifully changing the subject. "Of course." He signaled for a server, and a moment later, a woman approached with a fresh pitcher, plus-sized, red curls escaping a hastily pinned bun, moving with an easy, unhurried confidence he didn't often see among event staff too nervous around his table to do more than tremble through their duties. "Apple juice, right?" the woman said, crouching slightly to Sophia's eye level, rather than simply pouring from standing height, her voice warm, unbothered by the weight of the Moretti name at the table. "I remember from the cocktail hour. You said the sparkling water tasted like bubbles arguing with each other." Sophia's face lit up, delighted. "It does. Extremely valid complaint. I'll pass it along to the kitchen." The woman poured carefully, glancing briefly at Luca with a polite, professional nod before straightening. "Anything else I can get you?" "No, thank you." Luca studied her for a moment longer than strictly necessary, something oddly familiar tugging at the edge of his attention, before he dismissed it, returning his focus to the auction paddle in his hand. He didn't notice, in that moment, the way Sophia's eyes had followed the waitress across the room with unusual intensity, small hands tightening around the arms of her wheelchair. The auction proceeded. Speeches were given. Vincent delivered his usual gracious remarks about the foundation's work, and Luca applauded at the appropriate moments, his attention drifting, as it always did at these events, toward the quiet ache of watching his daughter sit motionless among a room full of people who could dance if they wanted to. He didn't see the moment it began. He only registered, distantly, a shift in the room's energy, conversations faltering, heads turning, a ripple of confused murmurs spreading outward from somewhere near the dance floor. Then he heard his daughter's voice. "Sophia?" He turned, and the champagne flute in his hand slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering unheeded against the marble. His daughter was standing, pushed herself up from the wheelchair with trembling arms, knees locked and shaking violently beneath a body that hadn't supported her weight in 3 years, one small hand gripping the chair's armrest for balance, while the other reached forward, unsteady, toward something across the room. "Sophia, Luca was on his feet instantly, every instinct screaming to catch her before she fell. But his legs had gone strangely useless beneath him, the entire ballroom fading into a blur of shocked faces and frozen champagne glasses. Sophia took a step. Her knee buckled. A bodyguard lunged forward to steady her, and she slapped his hand away with fierce, determined focus, her attention locked entirely on something, someone, across the crowded dance floor. Another step, then another, faster now, desperate, her small body shaking with effort that should have been impossible after 3 years of atrophied muscle and shattered nerve pathways. "Baby!" Luca's voice cracked entirely, tears blurring his vision, but Sophia wasn't looking at him. She was looking past him, past the crowd, past the doctors who'd spent 3 years trying to give her exactly this moment. Hannah Carter stood frozen near the dance floor's edge, silver tray trembling in her hands, her face draining of every trace of color as Sophia's eyes found hers across the room. "No," Hannah breathed, so quietly, only she heard it. The tray slipped from her fingers. Crystal exploded across the marble floor, and the sound seemed to break whatever invisible thread had been holding Sophia's steps steady, sending her stumbling forward into a full, desperate run, against every diagnosis, every prediction, everything 3 years of specialists had assured Luca was permanently, irrevocably impossible. She ran straight into Hannah's arms. Hannah collapsed to her knees on the marble, catching Sophia's small body against her chest with a sob that tore through the stunned, silent ballroom, clutching her as though she'd spent 3 years searching for exactly this moment and had never once believed she'd get it. Sophia buried her face against Hannah's shoulder, small shoulders shaking with sobs of her own. "You kept your promise," she whispered, muffled but unmistakable, the words carrying through the ballroom's shocked silence like a confession neither woman had meant for anyone else to hear. Luca stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, his entire world narrowing to those 4 words, understanding arriving in slow, devastating waves. Promise. His daughter had never met this woman. At least, that was what he had believed, every single day for 3 years. Watching Hannah Carter clutch his sobbing daughter to her chest, like something precious and long lost, Luca understood, with absolute, gut-wrenching certainty, that someone had been keeping a secret from him about the worst night of his life, and that the answer to a question he'd spent 3 years and a fortune trying to solve had been standing in his own ballroom, pouring apple juice the entire time. The ballroom didn't fully recover for nearly 10 minutes. Guests clustered in murmuring circles, phones discreetly angled despite the hotel's strict no-photography policy for the Moretti table, waitstaff frozen mid-service, unsure whether to continue as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. Chef Marco appeared at Hannah's shoulder within moments, his usual gruffness entirely absent, crouching low beside her and Sophia with quiet concern. "Hannah, you need to breathe." "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice shook, one hand still cradling the back of Sophia's head, the little girl's arms locked fiercely around her neck. Luca reached them seconds later, dropping to his knees on the marble beside his daughter, his usual iron composure entirely dissolved. "Sophia, baby, look at me." Sophia lifted her head reluctantly, tears streaking her flushed cheeks, though something in her expression had transformed entirely. Not the careful, guilty sadness Luca had grown accustomed to, but something closer to wonder. "Daddy," I stood up, she said, breathless. "I ran. I saw." His voice broke on the words. "I saw you, baby." Hannah kept her promise. Sophia turned back toward the woman still holding her, small hand pressed against Hannah's cheek with unmistakable affection. She said she would. Luca's eyes lifted to Hannah's face, and for the first time since the miracle had unfolded across his ballroom, he really looked at her. The trembling in her hands not yet settled, the careful, guarded wariness behind her green eyes, a woman who very clearly hadn't planned for this moment to happen in front of 300 witnesses. "What promise?" Luca said quietly, is my daughter talking about?" Hannah's throat worked, something like panic flickering across her expression before she caught herself, composing her face into something more careful. "Mr. Moretti, I think we should discuss this somewhere private. Now." "Luca." Vincent's voice, low and steadying, appeared at his shoulder, one hand resting gently on his arm. "Not here. Not with half the city's press corps watching every move. Let's move this inside." They gathered 20 minutes later in a small private office off the hotel's main lobby, the gala continuing at a considerably subdued volume beyond the closed door. Sophia sat in a chair rather than her wheelchair, still shaky but insistent, refusing to let go of Hannah's hand even as Claire, hastily summoned from the therapy team on standby for the evening, checked her over with careful, professional attention. "Physically, she's fine," Claire said finally, straightening. "Exhausted, and she'll likely be sore tomorrow from muscles that haven't borne weight in years, but nothing alarming. What just happened medically is—" She hesitated. "Frankly, I don't have a clean explanation. Adrenaline surge, neurological pathway reactivation under extreme emotional stimulus. It's documented in rare cases, but I've never witnessed it myself. I don't need a medical explanation." Luca's eyes hadn't left Hannah since they'd entered the room. "I need an actual one." Hannah sat across from him, Sophia still pressed against her side, and took a slow breath. 3 years ago," she said quietly, "I was driving home from a late shift. I take Route 9 along the river most nights. It's faster than the highway." Her hands twisted together in her lap. "I saw the bridge go. Ashwood Bridge. I still don't fully understand what happened. The structural failure. None of it. I just saw the middle section collapse, and I saw a car go into the water." Luca went very still. "I called 911 immediately, but the response time out there, that time of night, I knew it wouldn't be fast enough." Her voice wavered. "I went in after the car myself. I'm a strong swimmer. I grew up on a lake. It felt like the only choice that made sense in the moment." She glanced down at Sophia, something tender crossing her face. "I found her in the back seat. Her seatbelt had jammed. I got her free, got her to the surface, and I held on to her until a boat found us maybe 10 minutes later. She was so scared and so cold, and she wouldn't stop shaking. So I just—" Hannah's voice broke slightly. "I sang to her. It was the only thing I could think to do. My grandmother used to sing it to me when I was scared." Luca's breath had gone entirely ragged. "The paramedics took her the moment the boat reached shore," Hannah continued. "I never even got her name. I just remember holding her hand until they pulled her away. And I told her I'd keep checking on her, that I'd make sure she was okay." Her eyes lifted to his. "I never found out what hospital they took her to. I called around for weeks afterward, but nobody would give me information, patient privacy, and eventually I told myself she was safe, that her family had her, that it was enough to know she'd survived." "You never came forward," Luca said, voice hoarse. 3 years, and you never once told anyone. What would that have accomplished?" Hannah's chin lifted slightly, something fierce beneath the vulnerability. "I wasn't looking for a reward, Mr. Moretti. I did what anyone should have done. Making it about me afterward felt like it would have cheapened something that should have stayed simple." Sophia tugged gently at Hannah's sleeve. "You promised you'd come back for me. In the water. You said, 'I'll come find you. I promise. Just hold on.' I did say that." Hannah's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I meant it. I just never knew how to find you again." Luca sat back in his chair, the full, staggering weight of 3 years crashing over him at once. 3 years of surgeons and specialists and rehabilitation wings, 3 years of guilt and grief, and a war waged against enemies who, he was beginning to suspect with cold, sick certainty, might not have even been responsible for the tragedy at all. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the woman who'd actually saved his daughter's life had been quietly, anonymously working catering events for his own foundation, never once asking for anything in return. "I've spent a fortune," he said quietly, "trying to find you. Private investigators, public appeals through the department, offers of reward money that went unclaimed for years. I needed to thank the person who pulled my daughter out of that river. His voice cracked entirely. And you were pouring apple juice at my daughter's table an hour ago. I didn't know it was her. Not for certain. Not until tonight. Hannah's voice was barely above a whisper. I've served this gala for 3 years. I always wondered. I never let myself ask. Why not? Because if I was wrong, I didn't think I could survive being wrong. Her eyes met his, raw and honest in a way he wasn't accustomed to from anyone in his carefully guarded world. And if I was right, I didn't know what asking would cost either of us. Sophia, exhausted now, had curled herself more fully into Hannah's side, eyes drooping despite her clear determination to stay awake for the conversation. Luca watched his daughter settle against a stranger. No, he corrected himself slowly. Not a stranger at all, but the single most important person in his daughter's memory for 3 entire years. And felt something shift inside his chest that he hadn't felt in longer than he could easily measure. Not quite hope, but something dangerously, achingly close to it. Hannah hadn't expected the invitation. It arrived 3 days after the gala, delivered by a man in a dark suit who introduced himself simply as Gabriel, Luca's head of security, his manner polite but unmistakably thorough as he confirmed her identity before handing over a cream envelope with the Moretti estate's address embossed in gold. Sophia has been asking for you. Please come, if you're willing. Signed, Luca Moretti. She almost didn't go. 3 years of quiet anonymity had taught her exactly how to keep her distance from complicated things, and nothing about the Moretti world struck her as anything less than complicated. She went anyway. The estate sat sprawled along the Lake Michigan shoreline, considerably larger than anything Hannah had expected, even after years of catering the family's events. Manicured gardens, a private dock, glass windows catching the afternoon light in a way that made the whole property gleam like something out of a film. Sophia met her at the door, in her wheelchair now, though her face lit up with the same unguarded joy Hannah remembered from the ballroom. You came! Sophia's arms went around her waist the moment Hannah knelt down, small and fierce. Daddy said you might not, because grown-ups get busy, but I told him you'd come, because you promised. I did promise. Hannah smoothed a curl back from Sophia's forehead. Took me 3 years, but I got there eventually. Better late than never. Sophia said it with the particular seriousness of a child repeating a phrase she'd heard often enough to claim as her own. Come see my art studio. I made you something. Hannah glanced up to find Luca standing in the doorway, watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something soft and a little lost, like a man relearning a language he'd once known fluently. She's been drawing since Tuesday, he said quietly. Wouldn't tell me what. Well. Hannah smiled, letting Sophia tug her forward by the hand. I suppose I'll find out. The studio occupied a sunlit corner of the estate's east wing, walls covered in Sophia's artwork, bright, uneven shapes that gradually, across dated pages Hannah noticed pinned in careful chronological order, grew steadier and more confident. Sophia wheeled herself to a small table and produced a drawing with visible pride. 2 figures held hands beside a river, one large, one small, both smiling beneath a sun rendered in careful yellow crayon. That's you, Sophia said, and that's me. And that's the water. But it's happy water now, not scary water. Hannah's throat tightened. It's beautiful, sweetheart. I used to draw the water gray. Claire said maybe I could try drawing it a different color, since it wasn't going to hurt me anymore. Sophia studied the drawing with a critical 7-year-old eye. I think blue's better, happier. I think you're right. Luca had drifted closer, standing at the edge of the studio, his eyes moving between the drawing and Hannah with something unreadable. She hasn't drawn the river in over a year, he said quietly. Refused to, even when Claire suggested it might help. I assumed she'd simply buried it too deep to touch. Maybe she just needed a reason to look at it differently. Hannah glanced at him. Fear doesn't always need to be forgotten to stop being scary. Sometimes it just needs a new color. Something shifted behind Luca's careful composure, and for a moment, Hannah thought he might actually smile. A real one, not the practiced, hollow version she suspected he'd been offering the world for 3 years. She stayed for dinner, at Sophia's insistent request, and Luca's quiet, surprising agreement, the three of them settling into the estate's smaller family dining room, rather than the grand formal one Hannah had glimpsed on her way in. "You don't have to keep looking at me like I might disappear," she told Luca, midway through the meal, catching him watching her again with that same careful, assessing attention. "I'm not entirely convinced you won't." His mouth twitched, something almost self-deprecating in it. "Forgive me. I've spent 3 years believing the person who saved my daughter's life was either dead or unreachable. Having you sitting at my dinner table is proving difficult to fully accept. I'm not going anywhere." Hannah softened the words with a small smile. "Though I'll admit, this is considerably nicer than my usual dinner. I generally eat cereal standing over the sink." "That sounds tragic." "It sounds efficient. There's a difference." Sophia giggled between them, and Luca's mouth curved again, this time settling into something that looked, unmistakably, like an actual smile. Small, rusty, clearly out of practice, but entirely genuine. "There it is," Hannah said softly, before she could stop herself. "There what is. A real smile." "Sophia mentioned you'd stop doing that." She flushed slightly, aware she'd perhaps overstepped. "Sorry, that wasn't my business to comment on." "No." Luca's eyes held hers, something unexpectedly open in them. "It's fair. She's not wrong. I haven't had much reason to, these past 3 years. And now?" He glanced toward Sophia, animated and laughing over her plate, in a way Hannah suspected hadn't been common in this house for a very long time, and then back toward Hannah herself, something warm and cautious passing behind his eyes. "Now," he said quietly, "I find I have considerably more reason than I did a week ago." Hannah felt her own pulse quicken, an entirely unprofessional reaction to a man who was, by any reasonable measure, dangerously far outside her world. But something about the honesty in his voice, the careful, unguarded way he'd let himself say it, made it difficult to retreat behind her usual defenses. "That's a lot of pressure to put on apple juice and a bad singing voice," she said, aiming for lightness. It wasn't the apple juice. His voice had gone quieter, more serious. "It was watching my daughter run for the first time in 3 years, straight into the arms of a woman who never once asked for anything in return for saving her life." "That's not pressure, Hannah. That's simply the truth." Sophia, oblivious to the weight settling over the table, held up her drawing again with cheerful insistence. "Can we hang it in the kitchen, so everyone can see the happy water?" "Yes," Luca said, not looking away from Hannah. "I think that's exactly where it belongs." Hannah began visiting the estate twice a week, an arrangement that had settled into place with a naturalness none of them had explicitly planned. Sophia's insistence, Luca's quiet agreement, and Hannah's own reluctant, growing inability to say no. She was in the estate's library on a Thursday afternoon, waiting for Sophia to finish a therapy session with Claire, when she noticed the framed newspaper clipping mounted near the fireplace, the only visible acknowledgement in the entire house of what had happened on Ashwood Bridge 3 years earlier. Bridge collapse claims 1 life, injures 7, structural failure or sabotage. Hannah read the article twice, something uneasy settling in her chest. She'd never followed the investigation closely afterward, too consumed by her own guilt over not staying to identify herself, but the article's careful hedging, possible sabotage, unconfirmed reports of prior structural warnings, investigation ongoing, struck her differently now, sitting in the home of the man whose daughter had nearly died on that bridge. "You're frowning at my least favorite piece of interior decorating," Vincent Russo said, appearing in the library doorway with the easy, unhurried warmth Hannah had come to associate with him over her past several visits. Luca insists on keeping it, says he needs the reminder. The reminder of what, exactly? That someone tried to destroy his family, and he intends to make sure it never happens again. Vincent settled into the chair across from her, something contemplative in his expression. For what it's worth, Miss Carter, I've never fully agreed with the official conclusion. The investigation closed faster than these things typically do, given the scale of the tragedy. What do you mean? I mean bridges undergo regular structural assessments. Warnings, when they're issued, typically leave a paper trail. Vincent's voice had dropped lower, careful. The initial report suggested inspectors had flagged concerns with that section of Ashwood Bridge nearly 6 months before the collapse. That report disappeared from the city's records within a week of the incident. Hannah's stomach turned. Disappeared how? That, Vincent said quietly, is a question I've asked for 3 years without receiving a satisfactory answer. She mentioned it to Luca that evening, catching him alone on the terrace, while Sophia finished her bath upstairs, the lake stretching dark and silver beyond the estate's manicured lawn. Vincent said a warning report went missing before the collapse. Luca's jaw tightened. The easy warmth he'd shown her over dinner replaced instantly by something harder, more guarded. Vincent talks too much. Is it true? It's an old theory, one I chased for the better part of a year after the accident, before the evidence dried up entirely. His hands gripped the terrace railing. I spent that year making very dangerous enemies, Hannah, based on assumptions that were never fully proven. The Castellanos denied any involvement. I nearly started a war I couldn't have won based on a rumor about a missing report. But you believed it, at some point. I believed a lot of things. In the year after my daughter's spine was crushed against a car door in freezing water. His voice had gone rough. Grief makes a man desperate for someone to blame. I chose an old rival, because the alternative, that it was simple, senseless negligence, that no one meaningful was responsible, felt considerably harder to live with. Hannah studied him carefully, aware she was standing on the edge of something delicate. And now I don't know what to believe. He turned to face her fully, something raw in his expression. I've spent 3 years building an entire narrative around that bridge collapsing because of my enemies. If that narrative is wrong, then everything I've done since, every alliance I've broken, every relationship I've damaged, trying to protect my family from a threat that might never have existed, was still done trying to protect your daughter, Hannah said gently. That doesn't disappear just because the reason behind it might have been wrong. Something eased slightly in his shoulders, though the tension didn't fully leave his face. Gabriel found Luca alone in his study later that same night, a folder tucked under one arm, his expression carefully neutral in the particular way Luca had learned. Over 15 years of working together meant Gabriel was choosing his words with unusual care. You're chasing the old bridge theory again, Gabriel said. Vincent mentioned it. Hannah mentioned it. Vincent apparently confirmed it. It's a dead end, Luca. We exhausted every lead a year ago. Gabriel set the folder on the desk, unopened. I understand the instinct, given everything happening with Sophia lately. But reopening old wounds without new evidence serves no one. Something feels different this time. Grief plays tricks on a man's judgment. Gabriel's voice remained carefully even. I'd hate to see you chase another shadow, boss. Especially now, when things with Sophia, and with Miss Carter, seemed to finally be moving in a positive direction. Luca studied his old friend for a long moment, something he couldn't quite name flickering at the edge of his attention. Not suspicion, not yet, but a faint, unfamiliar unease he hadn't felt around Gabriel in all their years working together. You're probably right, he said finally, though the words felt less certain than he intended them to sound. Gabriel nodded, gathering the folder back under his arm, and left without further comment. Alone in his study, Luca found himself staring at the framed photo on his desk. Elena, smiling, holding a much younger Sophia on her hip. Taken less than a year before the accident that had claimed his wife's presence from his life entirely, though she'd survived the crash itself, only to succumb to injuries 3 days later in the hospital, a loss the official record listed separately from Sophia's paralysis, but which Luca had never once been able to separate in his own grief. Choose compassion over fear, Elena had told him once, years ago, in a conversation he hadn't thought about in longer than he cared to admit. He wondered, staring at her photograph, whether chasing this old shadow again counted as compassion or simply another form of the fear he'd been drowning in for 3 years. He didn't yet know that Gabriel's carefully even voice, his practiced dismissal of the missing report, had been steering him away from a truth Gabriel himself had spent 3 years working very hard to keep buried. Hannah noticed the car on Tuesday. She wouldn't have thought anything of it, a dark sedan idling across from the diner where she picked up her weekly grocery order, except that she saw it again Wednesday, parked near the bus stop she used on her way to the estate, and a third time Thursday, trailing at a careful distance as she walked the final 2 blocks toward the Moretti gates. She mentioned it to Luca that evening, more out of unease than any real expectation that it meant something. His entire demeanor shifted instantly. "Describe it," he said, already reaching for his phone. "Make, color, any details on the plates." "Dark sedan." "I didn't catch the plates. I wasn't exactly trying to memorize a car. Luca, I thought it was probably nothing." "It's not nothing." He was already speaking into the phone, low and urgent, directing Gabriel to pull surveillance from the estate's outer cameras and cross-reference anything matching her description near the property in the past week. "You should have told me Tuesday. I didn't want to overreact over a parked car. In my world, Hannah, a parked car following the same route 3 days running is never just a parked car." His jaw was tight, something fierce and protective, replacing the warmth she'd grown accustomed to over the past 2 weeks. "You're not going home alone tonight. I'll have a driver take you, and someone will be posted near your building until we understand what this is." "That's not necessary." "It's entirely necessary." His voice softened slightly, though the underlying urgency remained. "You saved my daughter's life once already, Hannah. I'm not prepared to find out what happens if someone decides that connection makes you a target." The attack came 2 days later, not at Hannah's apartment, but at the estate itself. She was in the garden with Sophia, the two of them working through a gentle stretch of afternoon sunshine on a blanket spread across the lawn, sketchbooks and colored pencils scattered between them, when the first gunshot cracked across the property. Hannah's body reacted before her mind fully caught up. She'd grown up around a father who insisted every child learn basic emergency drills, and the instinct surfaced now with startling clarity, pulling Sophia against her chest and rolling them both behind the low garden wall as more shots rang out, closer this time, shouting erupting from the direction of the main house. "Stay down," she breathed against Sophia's ear, the little girl trembling but silent, small fingers gripping Hannah's shirt with desperate strength. "I've got you, sweetheart. I've got you. Just stay down." She could hear Luca's voice somewhere across the lawn, sharp with commands, Gabriel's security team scrambling into defensive positions around the property's perimeter. Hannah kept her body curved protectively over Sophia's, scanning the garden for any closer route to shelter, her heart hammering against her ribs. A man in dark clothing broke from the tree line 30 feet away, weapon raised, moving with purposeful speed toward their position. Hannah didn't think. She grabbed a heavy garden stone from the low wall's edge and threw it with every ounce of strength she had, catching the man across the shoulder hard enough to stagger his advance, buying precious seconds before one of Gabriel's men dropped him with a controlled shot from across the lawn. "Move!" Gabriel's voice, urgent, appearing at the garden wall moments later, weapon still raised, sweeping the tree line for further threats. "Get her inside, now!" Hannah scooped Sophia up despite the girl's weight, adrenaline lending her strength she didn't usually possess, and sprinted for the house's side entrance while gunfire continued to crack behind them, Gabriel's team engaging whatever remained of the attacking force. She reached the safe room off the estate's lower level, a reinforced space Hannah hadn't even known existed until this exact moment, and collapsed inside, with Sophia still clutched tight against her chest, both of them shaking, the heavy door sealing behind them with a solid, mechanical thud. "You're okay," Hannah gasped, checking Sophia over with frantic hands. "You're okay, sweetheart. I've got you. You're safe." Sophia sobbed against her shoulder, and Hannah held her, murmuring soft, wordless reassurance until the girl's trembling began, slowly, to ease. Luca found them 20 minutes later, the attack repelled, 3 assailants dead and 1 captured for questioning, his face pale with an emotion Hannah had never seen on him before. Not the controlled fury she'd expected, but something closer to raw, unguarded terror. "Sophia." He crossed the safe room in 2 strides, pulling his daughter from Hannah's arms and holding her fiercely against his chest. "Are you hurt? Baby, look at me. Are you hurt anywhere?" "I'm okay, Daddy. Hannah kept me safe." Luca's eyes found Hannah over his daughter's shoulder, something overwhelming and complicated passing behind them. "You threw a rock at an armed man," he said, disbelief edging his voice. It was the only weapon available. Hannah's hands still shook slightly, adrenaline only beginning to fade. "I wasn't exactly thinking strategically. You put yourself directly between my daughter and gunfire." His voice cracked slightly. "You could have died protecting her. I wasn't going to just watch." Hannah met his eyes steadily, despite her own lingering fear. "She's not just someone I saved once and moved on from, Luca. I don't know how to explain it, but she matters to me. That's not something that requires calculation in the moment. It's just instinct." Something shifted entirely in Luca's expression. The last remaining walls he'd kept carefully in place since the gala finally, completely dissolving. "Gabriel's questioning the survivor now," he said quietly, shifting Sophia gently to rest against his shoulder, his free hand reaching for Hannah's without hesitation, holding it tightly. "But whatever he learns, I need you to understand something first." "What?" "You have my complete trust." His thumb traced gently across her knuckles. "Not because you saved Sophia 3 years ago. Not even because you just put yourself in front of a gun for her today." His eyes held hers, raw and entirely unguarded. "Because in every single moment I've watched you with my daughter, you've never once asked what being close to this family might cost you. That kind of trust isn't something I offer easily, Hannah. I'm offering it to you now." Hannah's throat tightened, overwhelmed by the weight of the day, the lingering fear, and the quiet, devastating sincerity in his voice. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "Not after today. Not after any of it." Gabriel appeared in the doorway moments later, his expression carefully composed, though something flickered behind his eyes that Luca, still too consumed by relief and fear for his daughter's safety, failed entirely to notice. "Boss," Gabriel said, "we should talk. Privately." Gabriel's private conversation with Luca lasted only minutes, though Hannah watched Luca's face harden considerably by the time he returned to the safe room, Sophia now dozing against his shoulder from sheer exhaustion. "The man Gabriel's team captured," he said quietly, once Sophia had been settled to sleep and they'd moved to the relative privacy of his study, worked for a private security contractor, not the Castellanos, not any family I recognize at all. Then who hired him? That's precisely the question. Luca's jaw was tight. Gabriel believes it's a new player testing our defenses, someone hoping the attention on Sophia and the gala made us look vulnerable. It's plausible. His eyes met hers, something unsettled behind them, but it doesn't explain why. Of everyone at the estate, they came specifically for the garden. For Sophia, or for me, Hannah said quietly. Neither of them had a comfortable answer for that. Vincent arrived the following morning with Detective Daniel Hayes in tow. A cold case investigator Vincent had apparently been quietly consulting for months, ever since his own doubts about the bridge collapse had resurfaced following Hannah's revelation at the gala. "I want to be clear," Hayes said. settling a thick file onto Luca's desk, his manner brisk and professional, entirely unimpressed by the Moretti name or the estate's considerable grandeur. I took this case reluctantly. Cold cases involving organized crime families rarely end well for the detectives who reopen them. And yet you're here, Luca said, because the original investigation doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Hayes opened the file, spreading photocopied documents across the desk. I pulled the city's structural inspection archive for Ashwood Bridge. There's a gap. A gap. 6 months before the collapse, an inspection was scheduled and conducted. The report should exist in the archive. It doesn't. Hayes tapped the relevant page. What exists instead is a brief administrative note indicating the report was filed and reviewed. No significant findings, but no actual report attached. No inspector's signature. No supporting documentation at all. That could be a filing error, Luca said, though his voice carried little conviction. It could be, Hayes agreed. Except I tracked down the inspector who conducted that assessment. Retired now, living upstate. He remembers the inspection clearly. Says he flagged significant corrosion in 2 support cables and recommended immediate reinforcement work. Hayes's expression was grim. He submitted that report through the city's standard channel. He has no idea what happened to it after that, but he's certain, absolutely certain, that his findings never matched the sanitized version currently on file. Hannah, seated quietly at the edge of the room, felt something cold settle in her stomach. Someone altered the record, she said. Someone with access to city infrastructure files and enough leverage to make an inconvenient report disappear entirely. Hayes glanced toward Luca. That's not the kind of access most private citizens have, Mr. Moretti. That's the kind of access that requires connections, money, or considerable fear of what exposure might cost. Luca sat very still, processing the implications settling heavily over the room. You're suggesting someone inside my own organization was involved. I'm suggesting, Hayes said carefully, that whoever suppressed this report had a reason strong enough to risk covering up a warning that, if acted upon, could have prevented a bridge collapse that killed 1 person and paralyzed a child. That's not the profile of a random bureaucratic error. That's someone protecting something considerably more personal. Vincent found Luca alone on the terrace that evening, staring out at the darkening lake with an expression Vincent hadn't seen on his old friend's face since the funeral 3 years earlier. You're thinking about who had access, Vincent said quietly, settling beside him. I've been thinking about very little else since Hayes left. Luca's hands gripped the railing. The list isn't long, Vincent. City contacts, infrastructure connections. That access runs through very few people in our organization. Gabriel. Luca didn't answer immediately, the silence stretching taut between them. He's been with me 15 years, Luca said finally, quietly. He carried my father's coffin. He was the first person I called after Elena died. I trust him with my life, with Sophia's life, more completely than almost anyone alive. I know. So tell me why, Luca said, his voice cracking slightly. Every time this bridge theory resurfaces, he's the one steering me away from it, calling it a dead end, discouraging me from digging deeper, always with a reasonable explanation, always exactly convincing enough that I let it go. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with visible care. I don't want to believe it either, he said finally. But you asked the right question, Luca. And I think, somewhere beneath the grief and the guilt you've been carrying for 3 years, you already suspect the answer. Luca closed his eyes, the weight of 15 years of trust colliding violently with a cold, mounting certainty he'd been refusing to fully examine. If it's him, he said quietly, I need proof, not suspicion, not circumstantial connections. I need to know beyond any doubt, before I confront a man who stood beside me through every war I've ever fought. Then let Hayes keep digging, Vincent said. Quietly, carefully. If Gabriel suspects we're closing in, a man who's kept this secret for 3 years won't simply confess out of guilt. He'll do whatever it takes to keep it buried. Neither of them noticed the figure standing just inside the terrace doors, close enough to have caught the entire conversation. Gabriel's expression carefully composed as he withdrew silently back into the house, already calculating exactly how much time he had left before the truth he'd spent 3 years protecting finally, catastrophically caught up with him. Hayes called 2 days later, his voice tight with the particular urgency of a man who'd found exactly what he'd been searching for. "I traced the administrative override on the inspection file," he told Luca over the phone. Hannah seated across the study, watching Luca's expression harden with every word. "It required a security credential from within your organization to access and modify that record. I have a login timestamp, 6 days before the collapse." "Whose credential?" Hayes hesitated. "Gabriel Costa's." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Hannah reached across the desk, resting her hand over Luca's clenched fist without a word. "Send me everything you have," Luca said finally, his voice gone flat and cold, in a way Hannah hadn't heard from him since the night of the attack. "I'll handle it from here." He found Gabriel in the estate's security office an hour later, reviewing camera footage from the garden attack with his usual calm efficiency, entirely unaware of what was coming. 15 years, Luca said, closing the door behind him. Gabriel looked up, something careful entering his expression. "Boss, you carried my father's coffin." Luca crossed the room slowly, Hayes's file clutched in one hand. "You were at Elena's bedside the night she died. You held Sophia when she was 6 hours old." His voice shook with barely contained fury. "Tell me why your security credentials modified the Ashwood Bridge inspection file 6 days before it collapsed." Gabriel's face drained of color, the careful composure he'd maintained for 3 years finally, completely cracking. "Luca, tell me it's not true." Luca's voice broke entirely. "Tell me there's an explanation that doesn't end with you knowing exactly what happened to my family and letting me believe it was the Castellanos for 3 years. Gabriel sat back heavily in his chair, all pretense abandoned. "The inspector's report flagged corrosion issues on cables I'd personally recommended the city delay reinforcing. Budget cuts. I'd pushed the contractor to postpone the work 6 months to save the organization money on a bridge we used regularly for transport." His voice had gone hollow. "When the report came through flagging it as urgent, I panicked. If it surfaced that my recommendation had delayed critical safety work, I'd have been finished. Disgraced. I altered the file. I told myself I'd push the reinforcement through quietly, before anything happened. But you didn't. I got distracted. Other business. I told myself there was time." Gabriel's hands trembled. By the time I remembered, it was already too late. The bridge collapsed 3 weeks later. Elena died. Sophia, his voice caught. "I've lived with that every single day for 3 years, Luca. Every single day. And you let me destroy relationships with the Castellanos over it. You let me nearly start a war based on a lie you created to protect yourself. I know. You let me believe, for 3 years, that I failed to protect my family from an enemy, when the truth is, I failed to protect them from someone I trusted completely." Luca's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Someone I would have died for." Gabriel said nothing, his silence its own confession. "Who attacked the estate?" Luca demanded. "The garden. Was that you too, trying to silence Hannah before she got too close to the truth?" "No." Gabriel's denial came instantly, desperately sincere. "I swear to you, Luca, I had nothing to do with that attack. I don't know who hired those men." Before Luca could press further, his phone buzzed sharply. Hayes, his voice tight with fresh urgency the moment Luca answered. "Mr. Moretti, I need you to listen carefully. I just received an anonymous tip. Whoever attacked your estate wasn't working alone, and they're not finished. My source says they're planning a second strike, tonight, at the estate itself." Gunfire erupted outside the security office window, before Luca had fully processed the warning. The estate exploded into chaos within moments. Alarms blaring, security teams scrambling into defensive positions, Vincent's voice shouting urgent commands somewhere near the main entrance. Luca abandoned the confrontation with Gabriel entirely, sprinting toward the house's interior, every instinct narrowed to a single, desperate priority. Sophia, Hannah. He found them in the upstairs hallway, Hannah already moving Sophia toward the safe room with the same fierce, protective instinct she'd shown during the garden attack, her body positioned between the little girl and the windows. "We heard the alarms," Hannah said, breathless. "I was already moving her." "Good. Keep moving." Luca pulled his weapon, positioning himself to cover their retreat as gunfire cracked closer, somewhere on the estate's ground floor. Whoever this is, they're better organized than last time. They reached the safe room's heavy door just as a group of armed men breached the hallway behind them, and Luca fired twice, dropping the lead attacker while Hannah shoved Sophia through the doorway ahead of herself. "Luca, come on. Get inside. Seal it behind you." His eyes held hers for one desperate, urgent second. "I need to help Vincent hold the perimeter. You can't fight them all alone." "I'm not alone." His jaw was set with grim determination. "Gabriel's still down there, whatever else he's done, and I won't let anyone touch this family again." He pulled the safe room door closed himself, the heavy mechanism sealing with a solid final thud, and turned back toward the chaos consuming his estate. His oldest friend's betrayal still raw and unprocessed, an unknown enemy tearing through his home, and everything he loved most in the world, sealed behind reinforced steel, while he fought to make sure they'd still have a home left to return to. Inside the safe room, Hannah pressed her back against the reinforced door, listening to gunfire crack somewhere above them, Sophia's small body trembling against her side. "Is Daddy going to be okay?" Sophia whispered. "Your daddy is very good at this," Hannah said, forcing steadiness into her voice she didn't entirely feel. "He's going to be fine. We're going to be fine." She scanned the small room's contents. A bank of monitors displaying feeds from the estate's security cameras, emergency supplies stocked along one wall. A comms panel she didn't fully understand, but recognized as a way to potentially reach whoever remained fighting above them. On the monitors, she watched chaos unfold across the property. Vincent directing security teams near the main entrance. Gunmen advancing from the tree line where the previous attack had originated. And Luca, moving through the lower hallway with brutal, focused efficiency, disarming one attacker after another with a violence Hannah hadn't fully witnessed from him before. Then she saw Gabriel. He'd emerged from the security office, weapon drawn, but instead of moving toward the fighting to reinforce Luca's position, he was moving away from it, toward the estate's private dock, a leather satchel clutched under one arm. "He's running," Hannah breathed. She grabbed the comms panel, fumbling with unfamiliar controls, until a channel crackled to life. "Vincent! Vincent! Can you hear me? It's Hannah. Gabriel's heading for the dock. He's got a bag with him. He's not fighting. He's running." A pause, then Vincent's voice, tight with fury. "Copy. I'll redirect a team." Gabriel made it to the dock before anyone could intercept him, his boat already prepped, engine idling. A contingency, Hannah understood with cold clarity, that he'd apparently maintained for exactly this kind of moment, 3 years of guilt finally catching up to him at the worst possible time. He didn't make it aboard. Luca reached the dock seconds later, blood streaked across one temple from a graze wound, weapon raised and steady despite the chaos still unfolding behind him across the estate grounds. "Stop," Luca said, voice carrying easily across the quiet dock. Gunfire fading now as his security teams gained control of the property. Gabriel froze, satchel still clutched against his chest. "You're not just running from me," Luca said slowly, understanding arriving even as he spoke it aloud. "You called them, the attackers, both times." "No." Gabriel turned, desperation cracking through his usual composure. "I told you, I had nothing to do with the attacks." "Then why run the moment gunfire starts, Gabriel? Toward a prepped boat, with a bag you clearly packed in advance?" Luca's voice hardened. You knew this was coming. Maybe not the exact night, but you knew someone was closing in, and you've been ready to disappear the moment it happened. Gabriel's shoulders sagged, all remaining fight draining out of him. I hired outside contractors, he admitted finally, voice hollow. After Hayes started investigating, I panicked, Luca. I thought if I could make it look like an external threat, an escalation from a rival family, it would redirect the investigation away from me entirely. I never meant for anyone to actually get hurt. I told them to target the perimeter, create chaos, nothing more. They shot at my daughter in the garden. That was never the plan. I swear it. Gabriel's voice cracked. The second attack tonight. I don't know who authorized that escalation. I didn't call for this. But you called for something. Luca's grip on his weapon didn't waver. You endangered my daughter's life. Twice. To protect a secret you should have confessed 3 years ago. I know what I did. Gabriel's eyes filled with genuine, devastating grief. I've hated myself every single day since that report disappeared. I told myself I'd find a way to make it right, and every day I didn't. It just became easier to keep lying. He set the satchel down slowly, hands trembling. I'm not going to fight you, Luca. Whatever you decide to do, I understand. I've earned it. Luca stood on the dock for a long, agonizing moment, weapon still raised, 15 years of loyalty and betrayal warring visibly across his face. Hannah, watching from the safe room monitor with Sophia asleep against her shoulder, held her breath. He didn't fire. Justice, Luca said finally, lowering his weapon slightly, isn't the same as revenge. I spent 3 years confusing the two, chasing enemies who never existed while the truth sat inside my own house. His jaw was tight. You're going to answer for what you did. To the detective, to the courts, not to me, alone, on a dock where no one else will ever know what really happened. Luca, you don't get absolution from me. Gabriel, not tonight. Maybe not ever. Luca's voice was steady now, though grief still lived beneath it. But I won't become the kind of man who solves everything with a bullet on a dock, no matter how much you deserve it. Elena wouldn't have wanted that man raising her daughter. Security teams arrived moments later, taking Gabriel into custody without further resistance. His confession, recorded, Hannah would later learn, through the comms channel she'd unknowingly kept open the entire time, providing exactly the evidence Hayes needed to finally close the 3-year-old case with the truth instead of speculation. Luca made his way back toward the house afterward, exhausted, blood-streaked, and found the safe room door already opening as Vincent relayed the all-clear. Hannah met him in the hallway, Sophia still sleepy in her arms, and Luca crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, pulling them both into his arms, with a desperation that spoke to everything he'd carried through the night's violence. It's over, he murmured, into Hannah's hair, Sophia, stirring gently between them. It's finally over. The days following the siege, blurred together in a haze of police interviews, security debriefings, and Detective Hayes's methodical work, building an airtight case around Gabriel's recorded confession. Luca handled most of it personally, insisting on transparency with Chicago PD in a way that surprised even Vincent, who'd known him long enough to remember a time when the Moretti organization handled its own justice, quietly, without involving outside authorities at all. You're doing this properly, Vincent observed, watching Luca sign yet another statement for Hayes's investigation. Cooperating fully. That's not the man I knew 3 years ago. The man I was 3 years ago spent his grief chasing the wrong enemies for so long he never noticed the real one standing beside him the entire time. Luca set down his pen, something weary and reflective in his expression. I don't want to be that man anymore. Hayes closed the case a week later. Gabriel formally charged with falsifying municipal records, obstruction, and conspiracy related to the garden attack. A plea agreement already forming that would keep him from ever fully facing the reckless endangerment charges his outside contractor's actions deserved. Though Luca had, in the end, insisted the courts handle it, rather than settling the matter himself. "I keep waiting to feel like it's finished," Luca admitted to Hannah, the two of them seated on the terrace where, weeks earlier, he'd first confided his doubts about the bridge to her. "The case is closed. The truth is known, but I don't feel the relief I expected." "Maybe relief isn't what closure feels like," Hannah said gently. "Maybe it's just quieter than you expected, less dramatic." Elena used to say something similar. He glanced at her, something soft crossing his face. "That healing doesn't announce itself. It just quietly becomes the new normal, one ordinary day at a time, until you look up and realize the weight's lighter than it used to be." She sounds like she was very wise. She was. Luca's voice carried no jealousy in it, only warmth, the particular ease of a man finally able to speak of loss without it costing him everything. "I think she would have liked you considerably." Hannah's throat tightened. "That means more than you probably realize." He found her in the garden 2 days later, the same garden where gunfire had once torn through afternoon sunshine, now restored to its former quiet beauty, flowers replanted where bullets had scarred the earth. "I owe you an apology," Luca said, settling onto the bench beside her. "For what?" "For 3 years, spent chasing revenge instead of asking the harder questions. For nearly getting you and Sophia killed twice, because I couldn't see the truth standing in my own house." His jaw tightened. "For taking this long to finally let myself feel something other than guilt." "You don't owe me an apology for surviving grief the way you knew how to survive it, Luca." Hannah turned to face him fully. "You made mistakes. You also built an entire rehabilitation wing for your daughter, funded a foundation that's helped hundreds of families, and never once stopped believing she deserved every chance at healing you could give her. Those things exist together. They always have. You have a talent for making impossible things feel survivable. I've had considerable practice believing broken things deserve gentleness instead of judgment." She managed a small smile. "Apparently it translates well beyond rescue dogs and river currents." Something shifted in his expression, warm and unguarded, in a way she'd only glimpsed in careful, fleeting moments before now. "I've spent 3 years believing love made a man vulnerable," he said quietly. "That letting anyone close simply gave grief and danger more to take from me if I lost them too." His hand found hers on the bench, fingers lacing together with quiet certainty. "You walked into my ballroom carrying a champagne tray, and every single one of those careful walls started coming down before I fully understood what was happening. Blame Sophia. She started it." "She did." Something soft crossed his face. "But I'm the one who couldn't stop thinking about you afterward. That part was entirely my own doing, same as it's been every day since." He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and Hannah found she had absolutely no intention of doing so, her breath catching as his mouth found hers. Gentle, unhurried, carrying 3 years of grief finally, quietly making room for something new. When they broke apart, both of them slightly breathless, Sophia's delighted shriek rang out from the terrace doorway. "You kissed! Daddy, you kissed her!" Luca laughed. A real, full laugh, the kind Hannah suspected hadn't echoed through this garden in considerably longer than 3 years. And Hannah felt her own heart swell watching Sophia wheel herself across the lawn toward them with unrestrained joy. The little girl's face lit up with an uncomplicated happiness that seemed, finally, entirely earned. "Were you spying on us?" Luca asked, pulling Sophia gently into the embrace beside Hannah. "Claire says spying is rude, but this doesn't count, because I was just walking by and happened to see everything." Sophia grinned, entirely unrepentant. "Does this mean Hannah's staying? Like, staying? Luca glanced at Hannah, something hopeful and vulnerable in his expression, despite the joy of the moment. "That depends entirely on Hannah," he said quietly. Hannah looked between the two of them, the man who'd spent 3 years drowning in guilt for a tragedy that had, in the end, revealed the truest kindness of her life, and the little girl who'd never once stopped believing a promise made in freezing water 3 years earlier, and felt something settle into place inside her chest that she hadn't realized until this exact moment she'd been missing her entire life. "I think," she said softly, staying sounds exactly right. 6 months later, Ashwood Bridge reopened. The city had rebuilt it entirely. New steel, reinforced cables, a small memorial plaque set into the stone at its northern end, honoring the one life lost in the collapse. Luca had insisted on funding the reconstruction personally, quietly, without press or acknowledgement, a decision Hannah suspected had less to do with public image and more to do with a man finally finding a way to give something back to a place that had taken so much from him. He asked her to come with him the day it opened, just the three of them, before the city's official ribbon-cutting drew crowds later that afternoon. "Are you sure about this?" Hannah asked, watching Sophia wheel herself carefully along the bridge's new pedestrian walkway, sunlight glinting off the fresh paint and polished railings. "I've avoided this bridge for 3 years, Luca said quietly, walking beside her. "I used to reroute an entire mile out of my way, rather than cross it. I think it's time I stopped letting it own that much space in my life." Sophia stopped near the bridge's center, looking down at the river below, calm today, glinting silver blue under the afternoon sun. Nothing like the churning, freezing water Hannah remembered from 3 years earlier. "This is where it happened," Sophia said, not with fear, but with the careful, matter-of-fact tone of a child who'd worked through the worst of her trauma with considerable help. "Where Hannah found me." "Yes." Hannah crouched beside her wheelchair, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "Right about here, actually. It doesn't look scary anymore." Sophia studied the water thoughtfully. "It just looks like water." "That's because it is just water," Luca said, kneeling on her other side. "It was never the villain in this story, baby. It was just where something terrible happened. The bridge didn't do anything wrong. Neither did the river." Sophia considered this with the particular seriousness she brought to everything. Then who was the villain? "Someone who made a mistake, and then made it worse by trying to hide it," Luca said carefully. "But even that person wasn't purely a villain. People are usually more complicated than stories make them sound. Like happy water instead of gray water," Sophia said, and Hannah felt her chest tighten with quiet emotion, watching a 7-year-old articulate healing with more grace than most adults ever managed. "Exactly like that," Hannah said softly. Luca had planned the rest of the afternoon carefully, though he'd told Hannah only that he wanted to show her something back at the estate, a claim that turned out to be considerably more elaborate than she'd expected, involving the garden restored to full bloom, string lights woven through the trees despite the daylight hour, and a small gathering of exactly the people who mattered most. Vincent stood near the terrace with a knowing smile. Claire waited by the garden's edge, notably dressed for an occasion rather than a therapy session. Chef Marco, of all people, hovered near a small table laden with the particular desserts Hannah had once mentioned, in passing, months ago, as her favorites. "Luca, what is all this?" "Sophia helped plan it," he said, glancing toward his daughter, who was practically vibrating with barely contained excitement in her wheelchair. "She insisted on the string lights specifically, said the happy water drawing needed a happy party to match." Sophia beamed, unable to contain herself a moment longer. "Ask her now, Daddy. I've been keeping the secret for 3 whole days." Luca laughed, low and warm, and turned to face Hannah fully, something vulnerable and certain settling over his expression as he reached into his jacket pocket. "Hannah Carter," he said, and the garden around them seemed to hold its breath along with her. 3 years ago, you gave my daughter a promise in the middle of a freezing river, and you kept it, quietly, without ever asking for anything in return. Since then, you've given both of us something I genuinely believed I'd lost forever." "Luca, let me finish." His voice was steady, despite the emotion clearly moving through him. "I spent 3 years believing love was a liability, that letting anyone close simply handed grief more to take from me. You proved me wrong. One apple juice refill and one happy water drawing at a time. He knelt slowly, ring box open in his palm. Sophia's small hand pressed excitedly over her own mouth beside him. I don't just want you staying, as Sophia put it. I want you here permanently, as my wife, as Sophia's family, not just her favorite visitor. I love you, Hannah, completely, and without a single reservation left. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, looking between the man kneeling before her and the little girl watching with barely contained joy, and felt the last of her old, careful hesitation finally, fully dissolve. Yes, she said, laughing through tears, as Luca rose to slide the ring onto her trembling hand. Yes, obviously yes. Sophia's shriek of delight echoed across the garden, and within moments she'd wheeled herself directly between them, insisting on being included in the embrace that followed, all three of them laughing and crying together, while Vincent raised a quiet toast from the terrace, and Chef Marco muttered something suspiciously emotional about needing to check on dessert. They married the following spring, in the same garden, under the same string lights, Sophia serving as flower girl from her wheelchair, with a bouquet Claire had helped her design specifically for the occasion. Halfway through the ceremony, unprompted and entirely unrehearsed, Sophia pushed herself carefully to her feet, steadier now, after months of dedicated therapy, though still requiring careful balance, and took 3 small, determined steps to stand beside her father and Hannah at the altar, refusing any assistance. I wanted to stand for this part, she whispered, when Luca reached down in surprise, because this is the happy part. I didn't want to miss it sitting down. Luca's eyes filled with tears. He made no effort to hide, lifting his daughter gently into his arms as Hannah reached for both of them, the 3 of them standing together beneath the flowering trees, while their small, hard-won family finally, completely came home. If this family's happy ending got you, hit subscribe for more stories like this one. If you enjoy sizzling hot Mafia romance videos, packed with action, romance, humor, and so much more, then Mr. Mafia Boss is for you. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.